right, today I am going to show you just a little bit of one of my favorite Desmos activities that I have here that focuses on how much tax we pay and kind of connects us back to proportional relationships. So first, let me just show you what this activity does. So here on this screen, I'm filling out this table about how much tax you're paying if you're paying 4% tax based on how many dollars you spent. So if I spent $2, it would be 8 cents in tax. If I spent $3, that would be 12 cents in tax. And this would be 16. And notice that as I am putting these points onto the graph, that they are showing up over here, as I'm putting them on the table, they're showing up on the graph. And so I like that connection between the table and the graph. And then as I go to the next screen, the graph that I just created shows up here. And so now I'm trying to write an equation, a proportional equation to connect back. And I find that writing equations and understanding why we write equations is one of the hardest things for seventh graders, at least, to understand how tables and graphs and equations and points on the coordinate plane, how they connect with each other, and why we would bother to have equations is just something that's very difficult for seventh graders to grasp. And so I love the way this activity kind of connects the table and the graph and the equation and the points on the coordinate plane. And then as I continue through the activity, here I still have my graph and I'm connecting it to a proportion. And it continues being part of the activity as I move forward. And so I'm going to show you now how to actually do this. How do you create a screen where you can connect the table on the left to the coordinate plane and then to the equation that you create? So I have got a brand new Desmos activity here. And I'm going to show you how to create that. We're going to get into a little of the CL coding, but don't worry, you can do this. If it gets to going too fast, just pause your screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my two screens that I'm going to use. And so on this first one, I'm going to use the graphing calculator all the way at the bottom here. And so I'm going to just drag this over. And then on my second screen, that's where I'm creating this screen. I need the graph on the left and I need this input on the right. So I'm going to pull this graph as one of my components, and I'm going to pull this math response as my other component. So I'm going to set them up like this. Now, the first thing we're going to do now that we have our screen set up is I'm going to name all of these components. So right here on this screen, if you look right up here underneath this plus sign, it says name this component. I'm just going to call this, let's just call this graph 1. And then as we go to the next screen, I've got a graph on this screen too. Notice here's name this component. So I'm going to call this one graph 2. And then over here, I've got this component. I'm going to call this input. Actually, let's call this equation because this is where kids are going to type their equation. And the reason why we're naming these is because then as we're creating the code that's going to connect all these things, this gives us a way to refer back to what are we trying to connect things to. So now let's set up this graphing component here. So first of all, I want to mention that if you want to change the screen, like let's say I want my graph to mostly be in quadrant 1, I am just clicking on the graph and holding down and dragging, and I can kind of drag this, or I can zoom in, or I could zoom out, and get your graph the way you want it. And then I'm going to go over here on the left side and I'm going to hit this plus sign and I am going to add a table. And if I want some points to already show up, then I'm going to type those points in. So let's say I want 1, 3, and 2, 6, and 3, 9 to show up. And then I want my kids to come up with maybe what 4 and 5 would be. Okay. So now I have this screen the way I want it to appear for my students. Now, if you go over here to the right-hand side to this little wrench that says graph settings, if you click right there, you can do things like add labels. Like if you want this to represent something like maybe this is, I don't know, days and number of shirts packed for vacation, or I don't know what it would be. But anyway, you can add labels for your X and your Y axis. You can also lock the viewport. So if you do not want your kids to be able to drag it around or zoom in and out, but you want it to stay here where you know your data is going to appear, you can click this button at the bottom that says lock the viewport, and it will keep them from being able to drag this graph around anymore. So now we kind of have this page set up. So now we're going to go to this next page. And now we're actually going to start doing our coding stuff. So here we go. If you go into this graph on the left, there's two things we're going to have to do. If you go up at the top, there's this little icon that says Edit Computation Layer Script. If you click that, you're going to get this field, and we're going to actually do our coding here. So again, don't worry, I'll show you what to do. So the first thing I'm going to type is background. And as you start to type this, it kind of pre-fills for you. And what I'm saying here is I want the background of this graph. I'm going to connect it back to the graph that we created on the other page. So if I do, when I start typing in graph, it is graph layer that I want. And then now I am going to actually connect it back to the graph that I created. And so the graph that I want it to connect back to is the one from the previous screen, which is graph 1. And then I'm going to hit dot. And I want this one that says calculator state. So now what I've done is I've said, I want this to show in the background, just kind of almost as like a picture, the graph that we just created on the last screen. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type in bounds. And then again, graph 1, because we want the graph from the screen before, dot bounds. What this line of code is doing is it's basically saying, hey, remember how I set that screen to show quadrant 1 and I locked the viewport? It keeps those same boundaries so that the entire graph still shows up. And then the last thing I'm going to type, this part's going to seem a little bit weird right now, but we're going to type in function, and we're going to name this F. Oops, I am doing a terrible job typing here. And then I'm going to put simple function. And then now I'm going to connect this to, I want to connect this to where the kids are going to type in their equation, which I called equation. Latex. Okay, so now what I've done is I have connected this graph right here to this equation over here, so that when the kids type their equation where it says equation, that's going to show up on the graph. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to get into the graph and I need to put this function f in there. And so now we're going to click where it says edit graph right in the middle of the actual coordinate plane. And my function, I'm just going to go back here really quickly. If you notice, my function is called f. And so when I go into my graph, I'm going to create f of x. And you want to go ahead and add a slider. And now what we should have is something that does what we just did. So let's go back. And if I hit preview up here in the upper right-hand corner, it lets me view this activity as a student could view it, and I can actually try it out. So I'm going to hit preview, and I can see these points are already showing up. And over here on the right, I can type in 12 and see that show up, and 15 and see that show up, which is what I want. And then I go to the next page, and I've got all my points there again. And then I want them to type an equation. I probably would really need to put some directions on the screen. But if we go back, I want them to type an equation. So the equation that connects this table right here is y equals 3x. And so if I go into this box and type y equals 3x, notice how that line that represents my equation pops up on my screen. And I just love giving students the chance to make this connection between the function being the individual points that they had to type in one at a time, and then seeing the power of an equation, that you type in the equation and suddenly you have the entirety of that function on your graph. Every single point you typed in, plus all of the other ones that you don't type in. And that connection I just find is really hard for 7th graders. So this is one of my favorite things to show them how to do. I will say, obviously, I forgot to put some directions here. So then up here in this title spot, I could say, write an equation, whatever I wanted to say to represent the relationship in the table. So now you know how to set up the coding so that you can make this happen. Now I'm also going to show you maybe the cheater's way to do this. It's a little bit easier. If you go to the comment section, there's a link to this Desmos activity. And another way that you can do this is when you find a cool Desmos screen that you really like, you can copy it and just kind of change it for your purposes. So let's say this did what I wanted it to do, but I just wanted to customize it. So I am on my teacher view. And when I'm in this student screen preview, up here in the left-hand corner, you can copy a screen. And so I'm going to just click that. And then I'm going to go into the activity that I want to use it. And I'm just going to put a blank screen and I'm going to paste it in, Control V. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to do that with the next screen as well. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to go in here and I'm going to paste it in. And then what I've got is I have the exact thing that was on there. So notice this is just like that activity had. And then here this is. Now notice in my code, I can go in and I've got some alarms in here, some little like, oh, there's a problem. Sometimes you'll have to go in, like in this case, it created some problems because I now have two graphs called graph one. But if I were to just go in and change like basically these two parts of the code and maybe this part right here, I could use this exact code and I could just change these three parts that I have highlighted here, and I could just use this that's already been created. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks.